Hello and welcome to She the People's Women Writers Fest. We try to bring in engaging conversations to you. This time, we have with us Leeza Mangaldas. She is one of the most popular sex education content creators in India, and she has been creating content on sex education for YouTube and Instagram for last 5 years. And she also hosts a podcast called the Sex Podcast for the audience in Hindi. And she recently was a jury member for our own Digital Women's Award and Summit. Today, we'll speak to Lisa about her newly launched book, The Sex Book. Congratulations, Lisa, on your book. How did you decide that this was the right time to write this book?
I have been creating sex positive content on the internet for the last 5 years almost. And I've really enjoyed creating short form content. But I do think that it's such an expansive topic, sexuality education, that it's hard to convey, everything you'd like to in a matter of 30 seconds or even 30 minutes for that matter. And so I really wanted to be able to structure the information and provide a sort of comprehensive resource for people who are keen to learn more, such that, answers to every question, no matter how awkward, and a multitude of different aspects of sexuality, the physical, the emotional, the body, but also pleasure, was all in one place. And so I really thought that a book is one of the most efficient ways of doing that. And it's this tangible thing, an object you can take with you and spend a lot of time immersing yourself in. I feel like with reels particularly, which is one of the most popular forms of content right now, you have someone's attention for 10 seconds, if that, and they're continuously scrolling. It's a very distracted way of consuming information. And so you might absorb some stuff, or you might get the sex that you didn't know you needed because it just pops up on your feed. And that's a great opportunity, given that we don't have sex ed in schools and there aren't very efficient delivery mechanisms for this information. Perhaps at some level, to pique people's interest, it's a nice way to just, for them to find it without necessarily knowing that they were looking for it. But I think once you do know you're looking for it, you need more than that. And so I really wanted to be able to dig deeper, to be sort of, more. I mean, I think to some extent also there's certain topics that you can't expound upon in such a short format, So I've been able to elaborate on topics I haven't yet talked about on the internet. I've been able to also add a sort of personal anecdotal voice to the subject as well. I wanted to make it fun and not textbookish, while still extremely informative. So yeah, for me, it was sort of the natural next step, I thought, in terms of making sex ed accessible and easy to get a hold of if you're looking for it.
How did you address the male gaze in your book?
Well, I mean, obviously, as a woman writer, I'm bringing a female gaze to the book. And it's an educational book. It isn't fiction. I feel like, to a large extent, the idea of the male gaze tends to dominate how stories are told, whether in cinema, art, literature, etc. In this book, I really wanted to try to have a gender neutral gaze as far as possible. It really is a book for everybody. And in so many ways, we're more alike than we are different. I think there's such an overemphasis on gender differences and such double standards imposed on men versus women, especially with regard to sex. And I really wanted to try and dismantle all of that. And so, to a large extent, I really try and posit this information for everybody, regardless of gender. Obviously, as a woman and somebody who's particularly interested in women and pleasure, I have paid special attention to that in the book, because I think that is systemically disregarded in the mainstream, right? There's very little information provided to people institutionally about women's bodies and pleasure, where there's much more information provided around men's bodies and pleasure, relatively speaking. There could be even more, but relatively speaking, most people know, erection, penetration, ejaculation. How does this work? Many people, including women, have never seen a labeled diagram of a vulva with the clitoris and its internal parts, or understood, what I just mentioned about the G spot. Like, to this day, I think women's bodies are shrouded in a lot more shame, stigma, and sort of misinformation than anyone else's. And so that's something that I definitely wanted to address in the book. But that said, I try to address, aspects of sexuality, the body identity that would be applicable to people regardless of gender, and also outside of just the binary conception of gender. I mean, there's more to gender than just man and woman. So yeah, I don't think there's a male gaze sort of conditioning my book at all. I definitely actively resisted the male gaze.
Let's talk about the title of the book. In a situation like India, if one of your readers are reading this book in a public space, they might come across weird glances, right? Because it explicitly says the sex book. So, was it your way of starting a conversation through it, or what did you have in mind?
Yeah, I think so often, even the people who are supposed to be providing information about sex and the body are still deeply sort of conditioned by a sense of shame. Whether it's doctors or family planning people or whatever else, we rarely call a spade a spade. They tend to still talk about sex as if it's something they don't do or have, and use all kinds of euphemisms. And I just thought, like, this is a book about sex. I mean, I understand it might be difficult for some people to, or they might, I don't know, hesitate to be seen reading the book or something. But I want people to actively overcome that hesitation, because it's just a normal part of life. I mean, if The Art of Not Giving a Fuck could be a global bestseller and a huge hit in India, and you're okay carrying this book with the F word on it, why are you not okay carrying the sex book just because it's actually about, sex in the body? I don't know. So to me, it felt like I want to own this. I shouldn't give in to the shame and call it something euphemistic like the birds and the bees, or I don't know, something. People are constantly using euphemisms. And I feel when disseminators of the information become messengers of shame instead of dismantling the shame, then you're inadvertently perpetuating the very thing you're setting out to dismantle. I really don't think there's anything vulgar or dirty or bad about sex. And I think the sooner we can own that and become comfortable with it, the better, I mean, everyone should be able to, ideally, in a perfect world, this book should have absolutely, zero embarrassment for people, right? It's just sex. So I hope we can get there.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Women's sexual pleasure is not something that we speak about openly, or women are not even allowed to expect it from anyone. Why do you think is that?
For centuries and in patriarchal sort of social structures globally, women's sexuality and autonomy has been controlled and surveilled, right? A woman is seen as her father's property until she becomes her husband's property. And marriage was an economic institution, the only kind of framework within which sex could legitimately be had. And very much an institution hell-bent on upholding the status quo, right? I mean, the only truly respectable context within which sex can be had in India, but I mean, even across much of the world, is within a heterosexual, same religion, same caste marriage, right? Anything else, whether it's unmarried people having sex, let alone unmarried women, queer people having sex, masturbation even is considered shameful and just lesser than in comparison to sex within a marriage in order to have children. An endogamous marriage, right? Same religion, same caste, very important here. Why is that? Because we literally want to reproduce existing social hierarchies. Women were seen as sort of like baby makers, essentially, right? Women are meant to have babies, not orgasms, and only with their same religion, same caste, opposite sex husband. That's been the kind of attitude to sex for so long that we're still, I mean, there's so much internalized misogyny and oppression as well, right? At this point, a lot of women themselves feel like this is just how it has to be because that's how society has made it for so long, that in some ways we perpetuate our own oppression even. I mean, marriage is still seen as so aspirational, right? From your young age, you're meant to think about your wedding outfit and ring. And it's like, so clearly I don't think very highly of marriage. But anyway, not to judge anyone, but that is the conditioning, right? That we receive, that we are meant to preserve ourselves for our husbands. And, these ideas that somehow a woman's body is not her own, that sex is not something women are entitled to. Good girls shouldn't want sex or have sex. Women only reluctantly participate in sex with their husbands. It's a duty. It's a sort of it's something you have to tolerate or you have to do in order to have children. It's never something that we're encouraged to see as a source of pleasure, a source of self-discovery, something that we can do on our own terms. I mean, even access to contraception tends to be so limited. Knowledge and access to contraception tends to be so limited, outside of the context of marriage. In India, the most prevalent form of contraception is female sterilization. Female sterilization is only available to women who are married and after they've had one child. Okay, what does that say about the state of affairs here? Less than 10% of Indian men use condoms, according to the latest National Health Family Survey. National Family Health Survey data. And 36% of people use female sterilization as their mode of contraception. So that reveals that unmarried people, young people, or people who are married but don't yet have a child are unable to access or utilize contraception, right? I mean, the idea is that women aren't supposed to have sex until marriage. Then they're supposed to have a kid ASAP, and then then it doesn't. Then whatever. So I feel that we have to unpack these ideas. Like, why can't women have sex for pleasure? Why are we systemically denied information about our bodies? Why are we systemically denied access to contraception and protection and services such as STI testing or IUD insertion or hormonal birth control pills? Why is it that we are still expected in 2022, almost 2023, to follow this extremely narrow and limiting and patriarchal approach to our own bodies and sexual and reproductive health and rights? So, yeah, I mean, in some ways, we're just still operating in ways that we were 200 years ago, because that's how entrenched these ideas are when it comes to marriage and women's sexuality and autonomy. So something we have to actively dismantle together. It's not just a women's issue, it's everyone's issue. When it comes to the sexuality and autonomy of women and queer people, everybody, regardless of their gender or sexual orientation, I feel needs to actively work on creating a society that's more respectful, inclusive, and celebratory of the sexuality and autonomy of people other than cishet men.
Yeah, I agree with you. Right. So, moving on to the next question. What do you think is the first step of fighting the stigma around women's sexual pleasure?
I think that, we can keep passing the buck and waiting till other people do it, right? Which is much easier than doing anything about it ourselves. Parents think schools should have sex ed, but schools think parents should talk to their kids. We all sort of just like don't actively have the bandwidth, maybe, or don't think it's our problem or whatever. But I think that there's so much change that can be achieved if everybody in their own little way, in their own home, in their own relationships, in their own family, with whoever, one friend, one sibling, your parent, your kid, literally whoever you're able to begin having these conversations with, whoever you're able to sort of change mindsets with. And but I mean, it starts with you, right? First we have to, I think, try and educate ourselves about this. I wish schools and parents and other sort of systemic delivery mechanisms of information would provide this. But since they don't, how do we break the cycle, right? How do we ensure we can be the change? I'm 32 now, and a lot of my peers are getting married and having kids. And I think that there's a powerful opportunity there for this generation of parents to talk to their kids about this stuff. Even if your parents never talk to you, if you talk to your kids, you can shape the attitude collectively of a whole generation, right? And then slowly over generations, things can change. And already I feel like there's a significant shift in attitudes from even our generation to Gen Z. I see like young people much more aware of identity and social justice and things like that than we were when I was that age. So I do think that even in one generation you can see significant change or progress in terms of mindsets. It takes time, it's not overnight, but I think generation to generation significant change is possible. And so it starts with you in your home, with whoever you can try to unpack this stuff with. Just do it. I hope that people don't see sex education as some sort of niche thing, some fringe thing, like, oh yeah, you know a cool thing to learn, like playing the ukulele or something. It is a fundamental thing. It is central to greater gender equality, to better health outcomes, to reducing sexual and gender based violence, to a more pleasure and love filled world. So we've got to make time. It's not some fringe interest. It's fundamental.
Absolutely. What did Indian women tell you, or any conversation you had with them while you were writing this book?
One of the most frequent messages I receive from women is, I've never had an orgasm. I've been married 6 years. I have 2 kids, but I've never had an orgasm during sex, or penetration just doesn't do very much for me. Why doesn't sex feel like it looks like in porn or in the movies where these people are moaning and having this amazing time? Like, I just literally look at the ceiling fan and feel nothing. That's a very common message. Like, why is sex not pleasurable for me? Is basically the refrain of a large number of women who write to me. And I think it goes back to the point I made earlier about women's pleasure being, an afterthought in the dominant script that we get about what sex should look like, right? Erection, penetration, ejaculation, and sex ends when he comes. That's the kind of operating principles of straight sex for most people. And it's not just in India, actually, that's all over the world. When you look at, if you Google orgasm equality, there's been studies done in various places, and straight women are the least likely to be able to say that they frequently or always orgasm during sex when compared with straight men, gay men, and lesbian women. And what does this say? Not that women's bodies are inherently difficult or complicated, or that an orgasm is too much to ask for, but rather that the scripts we're fed for what heterosexual sex should look like do not sufficiently prioritize women's pleasure, right? Why is it that more women in relationships with other women are able to say that they frequently and always orgasm during sex as compared to women in relationships with men? Perhaps because women understand each other's pleasure a bit better than straight men are encouraged to understand. And so we need to unpack this, right? I think it takes a collective commitment to accessing accurate information that is gender equal in its portrayal of pleasure. And we understand that women's pleasure is not difficult or complicated, but rather that the script we've been fed is not accurate in its assumptions about how women's pleasure function. So many women are so let's say sort of like pleasantly surprised when they use a vibrator for the first time and have an orgasm in about 3 minutes. Because a vibrator provides extremely effective, consistent, focused clitoral stimulation. And they just like, oh my gosh, I thought my body was broken, but gosh, it's so easy to have an orgasm. People have this sort of eureka moment often when using a vibrator for the first time, because it's so contrary to the information they've been fed thus far. We still get the idea that for women, pleasure is not something we should feel entitled to, that it is too much to ask, that our pleasure is too difficult, complicated, and takes too long. But that's not the case. We just need to rethink what we've been taught about it, and understand how it actually works.
Uh, for young people in India, uh, the curiosity regarding their changing bodies, sexuality, and any conversation regarding sexual health uh, is not addressed in a very legit manner. So, the only place that they can go for to get answers for the questions is porn. And porn can be misleading, and the male gaze and a lot of larger than life portrayal of sex and misinformation is present there. So, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, in the absence of sex education in schools and at home, globally, porn in the internet era serves as a sort of stand-in for the first visual reference point, or actually any kind of reference point for sex for young people. And a lot of mainstream free internet porn is problematic in its representation of sort of, you know, well, I think it's often misogynistic, it's often violent. Ideas of consent are often not sufficiently clear. Was this clip consensually filmed? Is the act consensual? Was it consensually put on the internet? These are often questions that you don't entirely know the answers to for whatever you've chanced upon and are watching, right? And also, porn is so central to the structure of the internet, it's so omnipresent that it's estimated that, you know, amongst people with internet access, something of like 50% of kids under the age of 10, if they have internet access, are going to stumble upon porn, whether deliberately or inadvertently. So it's something we need to think about and talk about. Porn literacy matters. And, you know, I think there's a growing movement of adult filmmakers who recognize that porn is being viewed as sex education, and so are trying to create porn that is more likely to provide a realistic and healthy vision for sex. There's this movement, you know, of ethical porn, often created by women or queer independent filmmakers, where they're trying to showcase a more diverse array of body types, a more sensitive portrayal of the emotional aspects of sex, you know, showing condom usage during sex, exploring a vast spectrum of orientations and identities in a respectful way instead of fetishizing, you know, certain races or certain orientations or certain age groups, as mainstream porn tends to do. And so, I mean, yeah, I can't, you know, as with anything in life, you could use a kitchen knife to cook your dinner, or you could stab someone, right? So porn, similarly, I feel for some people might be a beneficial thing where you feel your desires or curiosities validated. Let's say you're a queer teen in a very homophobic town, and you think there's something wrong with you. Perhaps it's quite liberating to view, you know, ethical queer porn and realize that there's millions of people out there who feel the same way as you, and that your identity is absolutely normal. On the other hand, perhaps if you're watching really violent misogynistic porn and you think that you know, the next partner, you're going to just choke her without her consent, that could be quite dangerous and damaging, right? So I think we need to understand that, like, on the internet, banning something is never a solution. Technically, India has banned porn, right? People are still accessing it. It's very difficult to ban anything on the internet. And banning something actually tends to amplify its appeal. You know, when you tell people, don't look at this, they want to look at it. So I think the much more sensible option would be to, you know, raise awareness around ethical porn, have a higher standard of regulation around porn such that non-consensually created clips do not arrive on the internet. So often people actually watching some sort of, like, you know, revenge porn or leaked private footage that somebody may have sent only to their partner, that's then like made its way to the internet, or, you know, acts of sexual violence being recorded and then put onto porn sites. And that's just not acceptable. And we need to do more to, from a cybersecurity perspective, to ensure that's not happening, right? Consent violations can't be entertainment or pleasure, right? So I think we need, yeah, a more nuanced and thoughtful approach, which involves educating young people about representations of sex in the media. You know, porn is created as a adult entertainment. You wouldn't learn how to drive by watching The Fast and the Furious, would you? So for young people to understand that is important. And then for, you know, various bodies that regulate this stuff, whether it's the sites themselves or social media platforms, or, I mean, various other aspects of the internet's infrastructure, I think need to do more to make sure that whatever adult media is available is there consensually, you know, consensually filmed, consensual act, consensually disseminated, as opposed to there being like all kinds of non-consensual content out there as well, where perhaps the people in the video never wanted it to be public.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. We recently saw America reverse the abortion bill, and very recently, Indonesia has passed a law that will ban sex outside of marriage. So, do you think that in the world stage we are somehow in a path of regression about when it comes to sexual health and sexual education?
Yeah, I often wonder about that. Like, what is progress? There's this idea that progress is linear, or that as time passes, we're moving forward. Laws like this can, both of the ones you mentioned, can really turn that on its head, right? I mean, in America, this law was fought for 50 years ago and established, and now they're overturning it. The right to abortion seems like, such a fundamental right. And the self appointed, head of the free world repealing that right is a travesty. Um, the Indonesia news is very recent, and I think it'll take some time to be implemented, and it'll be something I pay attention to. Again, it seems like a huge sort of step backward for human rights, and it's so early that it's hard to see whether and how it'll all pan out. But it would seem like criminalizing sex before marriage or outside of marriage, um, in 2023 is absurd. I mean, what if you never want to get married, right? And why should the state be intervening in your personal life in the first place?
Yeah, I agree with you. Right. So, did you come across any shocking incidents or any anecdotes that stuck with you before you wrote this book? Something regard that women have shared with you regarding taboos or stigma around pleasure or their own bodies? Any stigma that you think were unnerving?
When courts bring up the idea that marital rape ought to be criminalized, even in 2022, we're seeing protests with men, saying that they're going to boycott marriage if marital rape becomes illegal. Think about that. They might as well walk around with rapist written on their forehead, right? So, I mean, at some level, I feel like the picture that we receive is that gender equality is not great in our country, right? Gender-based violence is high. Those are the types of messaging I feel that surrounds how women and sex are spoken of or reported of in India. And obviously, there's evidence to suggest that. But I've actually been what gives me a lot of hope is that I have received so much support. I think people are interested in changing this and are keen to get this information, are keen to have access to culturally relevant and judgment free and scientifically accurate, honest information about sex and the body and their rights and pleasure. Have received much less pushback and much more support. And so I think that even if people have to go on a journey before they are able to feel comfortable talking about this stuff publicly, privately, whether it's in DMs or just watching it on your phone or sharing it with a friend or in whatever ways that you feel safe doing this, most young people think this must be done and are responding to this information with like the desire for more. I get like, thank you, Didi, please can you also talk about this, much more often than I get, how dare you talk about this, or like, something that tries to silence or shame me for doing what I'm doing. So that gives me a lot of hope. I think that many, exactly for the same reasons that I started doing what I'm doing, which was a frustration with the way things are, especially for women and queer people. I feel like that's a shared frustration. There is a desire for a more inclusive, more kind and gender equal ecosystem, and it's not just in India, globally. And so I think, I mean, that's our best hope for change.
Yeah, right. Thank you so much for joining us, Leeza. It was lovely speaking to you, and congratulations on your book. Uh, Hope it does great.
Thank you. It's, yeah, it's available online on Amazon as well as in store.